All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. It is so far a beautiful summer day in New York, maybe not for much longer, but I'm realizing that it's been 52 years since I had seen this picture when it opened, probably the longest gap of any movie that we have tackled here on New Plaza Cinema's classic film talkbacks. And rather than my usual spiel here today, I thought I would quote you the first of two passages I'd like to quote from a gentleman, a friend of mine who I think is one of America's more underrated film writers. His name is Tim Lucas, and he's best known for publishing the magazine Video Watchdog for 20 some odd years. This is a piece that he wrote on Summer of '42 for Quentin Tarantino's New Beverly Cinema 4 or 5 years ago when they were showing the film. And here's an excerpt, and this is apropos to Max's lecture the other day, which hopefully many of you tuned in for. So, Summer of '42 was Warner Brothers' most surprising hit of 1971, a year that also found the studio upping the ante to the level of Dirty Harry, The Devils, and A Clockwork Orange. Amid such menacing scenery, something like Vincent Minnelli's 1956 Tea and Sympathy, which was the former standard bearer of this kind of storyline, suddenly seemed quaint, if not ridiculous. A newer, more relevant model was called for, a need apparently also noted by the makers of Carnal Knowledge and The Last Picture Show. Two other films released that same year, which covered similar ground, though with much more adult cynicism. There was room at the table for all these varieties, but what made Summer of '42 so popular was how it managed to be romantic enough to please teenage girls and raunchy enough to keep teenage boys amused and in their seats. These qualities were also masterfully filtered through a soft focus, yet also heart-punching nostalgia, the magic ingredient that sold this picture to everyone who would survive their teenage years to settle down and have teenagers of their own. Now, Max, I recognize that this is an original Warner Brothers trailer because it's the same narrator as we hear on The Wild Bunch. Once you hear that voice, you can't forget it.
Very good, Gary. I am impressed. I wouldn't have recognized that. This is the original trailer, and it's very short. It's 60 seconds. And this is the film I was expecting to see. I'll follow up on that theory after we take a look at the original trailer to Summer of '42.
And that house up there, that was her house. And nothing from that first day I saw her, and no one that has happened to me since, has ever been as frightening and as confusing. For no person I've ever known has ever done more to make me feel more sure, more insecure, more important, and less significant.
In everyone's life, there's a summer of '42.
So that all sounds very, very serious. But Summer of '42, for at least the first hour and 16 minutes or so, isn't that theme. I would argue that it's a coming of age story, but it's an adolescent boys trying to deal with sexuality and maturity and sexual feelings during the early 1940s. And it plays a lot like a comedy for quite a while. We can talk more about that. But then the last 25 minutes or so, when the Gary Grimes character goes to Jennifer O'Neill's home after, and then of course discovers the tragic news about her husband overseas, that it takes on the tone of the trailer we just saw. Any thoughts on that, Gary?
Well, I think that watching it again today, 52 years later, and it's certainly a film that's stayed in my mind for big chunks of it, certainly over 5+ decades. We can't call it one of the great films of that extraordinary year, but I think that we see, and I think you'll agree, Robert Mulligan is kind of almost a forgotten director these days, very, very underrated, particularly in his handling of young actors and To Kill a Mockingbird. And The Man in the Moon, which I think was his final film that introduced Reese Witherspoon way at the tail end of his career. there's something exceptional about the way he handles these young actors. And to me, at least, a little bit of a sense that there's a little bit of like trouble on the horizon or something. And when we see a young guy, a young soldier jumping on the boat, going somewhere, we have a feeling that, you know, that may be the last time we see that fellow. And that this kind of tension that breaks out even into violence between these young boys from time to time, it presages some kind of painful transition that may be ahead.
Very well stated. And I do agree, Robert Mulligan is a director worthy of more attention. He came from New York City. He was born in 1925. And I'm reading from Ephraim Katz's film encyclopedia here, that Mulligan, he was the son of a New York City policeman. He intended to become a priest, but his theological studies were interrupted by World War II service as a radio operator with the Marines. I love these career pivots that so many iconic film people have.
Yes.
And long story short, he is in the 1950s going to be ending up in television, starting out at CBS as a messenger, doing television dramas considered of high quality. He makes his theatrical film directing debut in 1957 with Fear Strikes Out with Anthony Perkins.
Fondly remembered by Boston Red Sox fans.
There you go. And that was a very powerful drama about with Perkins playing a baseball player with mental illness. And then he's going to be teaming up with the director we've talked about before, Alan J. Pakula, who will produce To Kill a Mockingbird in 1962. And they're also going to be working together, I believe, on Inside Daisy Clover with Robert Redford and Natalie Wood. His filmography, it's hard. It doesn't jump out at you. These are adult, very low-key adult dramas in certain situations. Films like I remember as a child seeing Up the Down Staircase with Sandy Dennis as a school teacher in 1967. Before Summer of 42, there were titles we don't really remember. I mean, Gary, you'll have to help me out here. The Stalking Moon,
well,
The Pursuit of Happiness.
When Summer of 42 came along in 1971, Mulligan had not really had a commercial hit since 1963, Love with the Proper Stranger, with Steve McQueen and Natalie Wood. And of course, the year before that, To Kill a Mockingbird. But there were those films you mentioned, Baby, the Rain Must Fall.
Also with Steve McQueen, right?
Lee Remick. Stalking Moon, a totally forgotten picture, but a very intelligent Western with Gregory Peck and Eva Marie Saint. So it's unfortunately, he was a director who almost barely doesn't exist in Hollywood anymore, making a certain kind of like mid-range adult drama. And this particular script was written back in the 1950s by a guy named Herman Raucher, believe it or not. Sat around for almost 2 decades. And at some point, the studio had it sitting on its shelf, and they purchased the script, put it into production, and very smartly, Mr. Raucher apparently agreed or did not agree to completely sign away all his rights in the film. He was paid a very generous 10% of the profits as the screenwriter, and he also retained remake rights, and also had the idea of publishing the script as a book as the movie came out, and it became a nationwide bestseller. I remember my paperback copy of it sitting on a shelf.
Well, and the Gary Grimes character is named Hermes, so clearly this is a personal recollection on the part of the writer, who, like Robert Mulligan, started out in live TV in the 1950s. He wrote for Goodyear Playhouse, the Alcoa Hour, Studio One. His feature film scripts before Summer of 42, they're offbeat, to say the least. We do have Sandy Dennis film Sweet November. We have the Anthony Newley film Hieronymus Merkin in 1969. But then he did write the script for Melvin Van Peebles' Watermelon Man with Godfrey Cambridge.
That is the most bizarre trio of credits I think I've heard in a long time. Spoken in one sentence.
No, if you saw, because the premise of Watermelon Man, which was a year before Summer of 42, is Godfrey Cambridge, who is made up with Caucasian makeup, plays a bigoted white suburbanite who wakes up one morning to find out he's turned black. So it's kind of a one-joke premise, but that was Raucher's script before Summer of 42 came out. And then the credits are a little sporadic after that. He did the follow-up film 2 years later, Class of 44. He wrote Ode to Billy Joe in the late 60s. the great success, although not critically, the Other Side of Midnight, the Sidney Sheldon epic.
Wow.
But he also did
Breathtaking.
well, and then he did some uncredited work on a rather acclaimed Louis John Carlino film with Robert Duvall, The Great Santini.
Oh, yes.
What his contributions were, I'm not certain. So what you said just a moment ago is so accurate. It's inconceivable to imagine someone like Robert Mulligan having a career as a Hollywood feature film director today, being able to go from drama to drama. It's unusual. And so Summer of 42 was a surprise success, as you mentioned, for Warner Brothers. He follows it up with a film I finally saw the other night for the first time, The Other, which is almost a gothic horror picture about two twin brothers, or one of whom may be an apparition. That's quite frightening in elements.
Another best-selling novel by an ex-actor, Tom Tryon.
Exactly. And then the other credits are somewhat sporadic. I mean, negligible. I mean, The Nickel Ride, which didn't get much of a release. Same Time Next Year, which was an Alan Alda, Ellen Burstyn comedy. Kiss Me Goodbye with Sally Fields. Clara's Heart with Whoopi Goldberg, and then Man in the Moon. So you would have thought Summer of 42 would have triggered a succession of major films, but the output was rather sparse. But he did have a long directing career.
Well, this is one other passage I'd like to read by our friend Tim Lucas, which I think is germane to what you're saying. Now, believe it or not, this picture cost only $1 million to make in 1971. And it became Warner Brothers' second highest grossing film in one of the studio's most remarkable years. It grossed $32 million 1971. And its success helping the studio to weather the commercial disappointments in 1971 of such now classic films as The Devils, Clute, McCabe and Mrs. Miller, THX 1138. The only Warner Brothers release to outperform Summer of 42, perhaps not surprisingly that year, was Don Siegel's Dirty Harry, which may have earned a few million more, but also cost a few million more to make, making their shared earnings something of a photo finish. It became the biggest success of Robert Mulligan's career, due in no small part to his post-release agreement to trim some of Oski's most bluntly sexual dialogue, allowing the originally R-rated film to earn the then GP certification, probably PG-13 today. I find this the most kind of startling fact about the history of the film now, and as Tim Lucas goes on to say, it's this softer version that is shown exclusively today, but even in this form, it remains one of the most truthful, honest films about sexuality ever addressed to all audiences by a major studio.
My memory of Summer of 42 was that it was an R-rated film, which is why I didn't go as a kid.
I remember some nervousness at the box office when I was 16 years old, but approaching a theater which unfortunately did not enforce the code and ratings. Fortunately, rather, did not enforce the code.
But it is intriguing that this was a time when the studios were making films with such moderate budgets before entering the blockbuster era. This was a film that technically did not have stars in it. I mean, Jennifer O'Neill, she was actually born in Brazil of all places, and she had by the 1960s become a model. This was an era, as many of us know, where you had models such as Candice Bergen and Ali McGraw and Jennifer O'Neill, who were entering the movies based on their spectacular looks. And the studio system was not at the point where it was training actresses or actors for the big screen as the way they had been. So Jennifer O'Neill, I believe, gave power to her performance in that last 25 minutes. Because when I was watching it this week, I almost felt that two directors were making the film. And of course, when Dan chimes in a little while on the cinematography, I felt the first hour and a quarter could have been directed by anyone from that era. And I'm saying to myself, this is a Robert Mulligan movie. It just didn't feel that way. Visually, it didn't look that way. From the acting perspective, I wasn't feeling it. But the last 25 minutes, for me, it had more of a poetic feel to it. And I thought, first of all, there wasn't a lot of dialogue between the two of them, but I felt her performance improved immeasurably. And I thought Gary Grimes's performance also improved during that time.
That's right.
For me,
go ahead.
No, for me, it felt as though Robert Mulligan had been taking a vacation and then came in to finish the picture. It just felt different to me, but that was just my own reaction to it.
The seduction scene is certainly un-Robert Mulligan-like in the context of most of his other films. But that's, to me, seeing it again now, half a century later, and I certain shots of it I never forgot. I don't think we have to guess what they are. But though there's no nudity at all in the sequence, it's, I think, one of the most remarkably erotic scenes that ever appeared in a major studio release. And it's just, one scene, never forgotten. I don't know how they persuaded the ratings board to downgrade the R, but I'm glad they did. But it's a remarkable piece of work, and like you say, more than a bit out of character with much of what else that we saw.
And it also gives us a sense of the risks in stories the studios were taking, because it hasn't been that long since the rating system has replaced the old production code.
That's right. 2.5 years, essentially.
Exactly. And here you have a story of a grown woman who's ultimately going to be having a fling with an underage young man. But this was the year, we have to remember, of a lot of explosive pictures like Straw Dogs and Clockwork Orange and The Devils and McCabe and Mrs. Miller.
A year like no other in that regard.
I'm sorry?
A year like no other in that regard, as you described in detail the other day.
Precisely. And one more thing about Jennifer O'Neill was a year before she had appeared in Howard Hawks's final film, Rio Lobo, because she really hadn't made that many pictures. After Summer of 42, she'll appear in Otto Preminger's Such Good Friends, which came out the same year, Blake Edwards' troubled film, The Carey Treatment, and then a number of other pictures that are not as memorable, but what's considered her best film that we chatted about briefly was 1976's the final film of Luchino Visconti, The Innocent, in which she was dubbed in Italian.
Which is a good film.
A good film in its own right. So I guess at this time, I think I'd like to bring Dan in to get a sense of what the look of the film was like for him, because for me, this is a film that it was almost the Last Picture Show light. I mean, you've got sexually interested adolescent boys during wartime going to the movies to pet with girls. And it's obviously a different kind of film that from the same year, The Last Picture Show, but it does have the same cinematographer, Robert Surtees. So Dan Cahill, our cinematography expert and filmmaker, take it away on Summer of 42.
Thanks for the intro, Max. You can tell from the opening still that's holding the title of the film that this is going to be nostalgic. It's sort of soft focus, as a lot of the film is, or it's got a diffusion filter over it, and the colors are kind of muted. The one peculiarity is, after this title card, the next title is production designer credit. Now, usually you see the lead actors cited, but that doesn't happen until the very end of the film. Not sure what was going on here, but it's just worth noting that it is a peculiar way to present the credits. Now we move on to Robert Surtees, who had a very distinguished career. I think he had 78 feature film credits. He shot movies that we all remember and have seen, like, excuse me, Ben-Hur, The Sting, the aforementioned Last Picture Show. And Mr. Surtees had been working for a long time. This was coming towards the end of his career. And I want to digress a moment to mention cinematographer Owen Roizman, who filmed Network that we discussed about a month ago. And Mr. Roizman passed away in January, I believe. And American Cinematographer recently posted an interview with him. And he talked about this very period of time, very early 70s. Roizman was shooting his first successful film, first one to be released, which is amazing because he won an Oscar for shooting The French Connection. And this occurred at a time when there was a change, a generational change in approach to cinematography. The traditional approach embodied by Mr. Surtees was to use hard light and sometimes too much light and carefully controlling the exposure on backgrounds, etc. Mr. Roisman came from New York, from a background in directing commercials, and everybody loved the soft light look from coming in from New York with overexposed windows in the background that were, as the DPs would say, they were blown out, white only. Well, that was not Robert Surtees' approach. And we're going to see that he's sometimes acting on the cusp of change here. Here we go. This is the opening shot of the film. And what I find interesting about it is the creative use of focus. You see that the sun and the water are in clear focus. The beach grass on the left of the frame is slightly blurry, and the beach grass up close, way too close, is almost completely out of focus. This I regard in high esteem. I think it's a clever way to introduce something. And similarly, this is one of the early shots of the three boys running along the beach. They're out of focus, or they go out of focus. And what comes into focus? More flora from the beach. I just think it's interesting and it's clever. And I don't know whose idea it was, but it certainly held my interest. Here's another intriguing shot. Those of you who know my discussions will know that I appreciate times when we only get a glimpse of something. And here we see Jennifer O'Neill in the rear at the left with her soon-to-depart husband. We barely glimpse them in the midst of this crowd of people leaving. But Mulligan was smart enough to know, oh no, we need another good look at her to see what's going on. And here we get to see her radiantly beautiful in a frame all by herself for the first time. As if we didn't know enough about what's going on here, we have intimate apparel on display on her clothesline, which tells us what all the boys are thinking. I included this shot for no particular reason, except it illustrates the fact that we never see any parents of the boys. And it kind of reminded me of the Peanuts cartoons, where you never see any adults except you hear some sort of distorted yammering from them in the background. Here we hear Hermie's mother shouting at him to buy, I can't remember what, a Time magazine for his father as he's leaving rather anxiously to get away from home. I'm also very fond of what a director will do with backgrounds. Here he composed a shot with an empty space in the middle, which he filmed with a couple of horses strolling by. Now, the script refers to the fact that they're all on an island for the summer. And somewhere I read that it was speculated that it was written about Martha's Vineyard, but the actual filming location was the coast of Mendocino in Northern California. But since one beach looks like another, they stayed closer to home and shot in California. And I admire, first of all, how lovely the beach and the ocean looks, and their ability to work it into the background very effectively in a lot of the scenes. So we never forget where we are. Here is a scene that puzzles me. This is the scene in the movie theater. And it's not surprising to see a scene in a movie theater begin with a shot of the projection booth. What's missing here is the projector beam. Usually a director or DP will go out of their way to show you that beam of light and flickering. You usually have to put smoke in it or mist of some sort before it will actually appear. Kind of like photographing rain, you have to light it from the side. There's nothing going on in that regard. Similarly, when we get to the shot of the four teens watching the movie, usually people in a movie theater have light flickering across their faces as the scenes change. Now, we know this is a black and white film they're watching. It's now Voyager. We see a few clips from it, but there is no effort here to make it look real. I don't know what brought this about. If it was perhaps a budget limitation, they had to shoot the scene in a couple of hours. It's hard to know these things, but it's puzzling that they're shying away from a chance to really evoke what it's like to be in a movie theater. Here we have Hermie and Oski after the cinema, as Oski is telling him that he was actually molesting the girl's arm. But what's interesting here is what you can do to study the lighting is count the shadows. And there are at least 4 shadows of these boys' heads behind them, which tells me automatically too much light. This may be an instinct that comes from Surtees' Hollywood training and experience to always make sure you light them adequately, but it's a night scene after all. He could have done this with 1 or 2 lights. Here is an example of the background being exposed properly. So we get to see what's out there. It's some sort of flora, again, a shrub or a bush behind Hermes' face. I like this. I like when you can actually get a sense of what's outside the window. And similarly, he uses window backgrounds. Also, one car in the background is parked. The closer car is actually driving by. And it anchors you in the 40s. Those definitely are vintage cars from that era. I just put this man's face up here. I think he did an excellent job in the scene. The scene played a little too long and was a little too predictable, but what made it work was Lou Frizzell's performance as the pharmacist. You never quite know how he's going to react to Hermes' confusion and fear, etc. But he ends up being rather nice to the kid and getting quite a few laughs on his own. Here is the fateful telegram. And I actually took the time to read this as much as I could. You see her name, Dorothy, and North Curry Street. The actual location is blurred out. We regret to inform you that your husband, and on that next line, it's actually letters AAC, with periods after them, all capitals. That would stand for United States Army Air Corps was killed in action over France. Now, I had no idea that we had our Army Air Corps flying over France in 1942. If somebody knows something about that, please share. We were certainly fighting in the Pacific at that time, but I'm bewildered by this. Not that it matters that much. This now is probably one of my favorite shots in the entire movie. This is a frame lifted from the extended shot where they start to embrace and they're slowly dancing and revolving in front of the camera. And I love what this frame tells us. Dorothy is in deep mourning. You can tell by the tear stain under her eye. She is clinging to some human life for obvious reasons, but she's also looking away, knowing perhaps that what she's doing, she may regret, or the boy may regret. It's a scene that is complicated.
A question for you about, or an exchange really about Robert Surtees, the cinematographer. I was under the impression that he was very adaptable to the directors he worked with. So he worked with Mike Nichols on The Graduate, and clearly Nichols's style emerged on screen. He worked with Bob Fosse on Sweet Charity, and perhaps indulged Fosse a little too much with the zoom lens, and I think perhaps Fosse wished someone had told him to stop, had kind of controlled him a bit more. And then, of course, Last Picture Show has a completely different look from Summer of 42. For example, Summer of 42, there's quite a bit of, not an excessive use of the zoom lens, but we do see it from time to time. We don't see that in Picture Show. So I would assume that a lot of these were perhaps Mulligan's inspirations.
I would too. And it's worth noting, now this is just from my own personal perspective, but I have never regarded Robert Surtees as one of the great artistic cinematographers. He was not particularly known as a technical innovator. And as you said, he was good at expressing the director's wishes on screen. He could embody what the director wanted. And that is a remarkable characteristic. It shows how he survived in Hollywood for decades and decades. And people kept wanting him back again.
Because he was adaptable.
Oh, God, yes. I mean, if you think of the differences between, say, just the 3 films I cited, Ben-Hur, The Sting, and Last Picture Show. You don't get any more different than that.
You can throw The Turning Point in there for good measure from 1977.
No, and these were both Oscar-nominated jobs that year, right? These two films.
I don't know. I'm sorry. I'll take your word for it.
Well, we'll look that up to make sure.
Okay. Anyway, Surtees was a craftsman, well respected. Gary, if you can tell us if he won any Oscars in his career. I don't know that. I should have researched that. But if you can.
Well, as Gary might look that up, it's worth acknowledging the composer Michel Legrand, who won an Academy Award for this theme for Summer of 42.
For just 17 minutes of music, too.
And it's fascinating, once again, comparing this to Last Picture Show, which was using source music, jukeboxes, car radios, period music. Summer of 42 does not do that. It has this Legrand theme that reappears, minimalist, with piano and a few other instruments from time to time. A different use of music. Legrand had, of course, come to prominence in France in the 60s with some of his scores for Jacques Demy, even for Jean-Luc Godard, and this was during his Hollywood period.
Well, he actually won 3 Oscars, Mr. Surtees, in his career for King Solomon's Mines.
Okay.
The Bad and the Beautiful, which is a beautiful piece of black and white.
Wonderful.
Ben-Hur, which is a piece of action cinematography, among many other opulent things. And he was nominated for both those films in 1971. I believe, however, Fiddler on the Roof got the Oscar that year for best cinematography. So
thank you.
Quite an eclectic career.
Yes. And all the 3 Oscars that he won were all richly deserved. We remember the look of The Bad and the Beautiful, and it makes me want to see it again.
And this was in 1971 in general, because this is a film from that historic year. It wasn't the start of the cinematographer as superstar, but it certainly was riding that wonderful wave in the 70s where the man, and they were men primarily, who photographed the films were as famous in intellectual and academic circles as the directors themselves. And you had a whole generation. Of course, Surtees is an older generation, but you had so many new names and older names that people recognize.
I would leap in and cite McCabe and Mrs. Miller, which was sort of the breakout film for Vilmos Zsigmond to be noticed. And everybody noticed his work there. And he carried on again with Altman on The Long Goodbye, which we recently did. Reminds me, I think we should do McCabe and Mrs. Miller sometime. I think that's ripe for one of our talkbacks, but never mind.
I wouldn't argue with that. And as I think I may have said on this program before, Altman said he had to stop working with Vilmos Zsigmond. I remember when he came to lecture at my college, after doing 3 films together, he said he couldn't afford him anymore because he was charging $5,000 a week.
Yeah,
and worth every penny.
That's right.
And worth every penny.
Yeah, and the other less well-remembered Altman-Zsigmond film is Images with Susanna York, which is a stunningly visual film. It's offbeat, and not many people saw it or admired it, but it's stunning to look at.
But this gives us an idea of the era of 1971, and you wouldn't associate a studio like Warner Brothers being considered a director's studio. I recall there was an interview with the production head of the studio, whose name we mentioned. We talked about him recently, Gary, because he was one of the producers on Americanization of Emily. John
Calley, right.
Right. And he was interviewed, I want to say, I can't remember whether it was Sight and Sound or Film Comment, where the interviewer was, and I don't remember the answer to the question, but the interviewer was saying something to the effect that Warner Brothers comes off as a director's studio. And this interview was around 1973, because let's face it, you have Robert Mulligan, Peter Bogdanovich, you have Visconti and Truffaut,
Kubrick,
and Ken Russell. But the interviewer said, "We noticed they didn't make a second film at Warner's. They made 1 film there." So
except for Stanley Kubrick.
Except for Stanley Kubrick, and of course later Clint Eastwood. But Stanley Kubrick, who had this long-term relationship. I don't know what that was about in terms of other directors not coming back. But But it was a time when directors were being given at least some leeway and some freedom to make their films in this within the studio system.
It calls to my mind one of the statements that Jacqueline Bisset made yesterday in our discussion after Lauren and Rose.
She was at New Plaza Cinema. We just had to get that little plug in.
Seemed to remember every single moment of her career, too, just calling stuff up at the drop of ever.
But she told a story about how she got cast in Day for Night. And the preface was she never got the official offer because her agent in California did not know who Francois Truffaut was. So it's time to kill your agent, please. Let's begin there.
Okay. Well, it's strange that an agent at a time, at an era such as this, 1971, 72, an era that was so director-centric, and there was such an acknowledgement of the auteur theory and such an appreciation of international cinema, and how there were so many Hollywood directors inspired by what European filmmakers were doing, that an agent would not be aware of someone like Truffaut is kind of scary. But Dan, did you feel any shift in the narrative the way I did of Summer of 42, where it seemed to go from impatient, a sexually frustrated adolescent story to this very pithy, deeper narrative by the last 25 minutes?
Yes, of course. But again, I think the tone is set right at the beginning with the voiceover. So it's not a disturbing shock to go back into something which is nostalgic, romantic, longing for something in the past. You described it the other day, Max, as a horny boy movie, and that's exactly.
I would never say such a thing, Dan.
I'm sorry.
An idea of suppressed adolescent emotions. I think that's the term I use.
And that is, if you guys know this, that is director Robert Mulligan's voice at the beginning and the end. He's the narrator.
Ah, thank you.
I did not know that.
Yeah.
I did not either. But yeah, I think we're prepared for this tone to reemerge later on in the film. It doesn't emerge as a big shock. So I think it does blend together rather well. But really, as I said a few days ago, a little bit of Jerry Hauser as Oski goes a very long way. And we really get tired of him by the time he's mercifully left off screen.
Well, I was reading a review from, of course, my usual haunt, the monthly film bulletin from 1971, and they were so charmed by the beach scene at night where the Hauser character was going over the sand dune and coming back and needing another condom. They thought it was delightfully funny. I found it rather arduous and annoying after a while, but that was.
He partly redeems himself at the end when he says, Hermie, sometimes life is just one big pain in the ass. It's a good exit line.
It is a very, very good exit line. And it is a testament to the studio styles of the time, policies of the time, that they would trust a feature film with a relatively unknown cast and give it a prominent release. This was not relegated to drive-in theaters and the bottom halves of double features. This was given a respectable theatrical distribution. And they were not afraid to take those kinds of risks.
Go ahead, Gary.
I'm sorry. Opened exclusively, according to Vincent Canby's review, at an art house theater on the east side of Manhattan, long gone from the scene, called the Fine Arts, which I believe is between Lexington and 3rd Avenue. It's just a little 300-seat theater or something.
And in Milwaukee, it opened exclusively downtown at our little haunt, the Esquire Theater, which used to be a newsreel cinema. And it played very extensively during 1971. Perhaps at this time, we can take some thoughts or questions from our viewers. Our next talkback, if memory serves, is going to be with Alan K. Rohde. Is that correct, Dan?
It is, yes. And let me put in the plug here. Alan Rohde was our guest when we did Casablanca, because he had written a massive and very informed biography of its director, Michael Curtiz. And he has now written a book, an entire rather thin book, about the next film we're going to discuss, Blood on the Moon from 1948, which is an important Western, and it embodies many elements of noir in it. And it's fascinating and well crafted. And Alan will be our guest to discuss the film.
And it's the grittier.
That's 3 weeks from now on July 16th. We're having a bit of a break in between.
Wonderful. And that's a grittier film from director Robert Wise. So we'll see Robert Wise's grittier side.
Question.
Hello, Marjorie. Welcome back.
Hi, yeah, I finally got on this time. Nice discussion. Great movie. But I got a very different impression about the trailer. I think, number one, I loved the similarities of the contradiction in statements as was done in Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times and the worst of times, and I was unimportant and totally significant. It was very good. But I thought that really did sum up the movie. I thought that the adolescent sex things was not the main thing. I thought the main thing was between Burmy and this woman, which it starts out with him looking at her and it ends with him, thinking about her. So I thought that the trailer really did sum up the movie. Just another thing I loved is the sound of the ocean. In almost every scene, you could hear the sound of the ocean in the background, which I thought was a great touch. Also, where were these guys suppressed? I never thought these guys were suppressed in the least.
Yeah, they were pretty open.
Yes, I thought they were ready to go at it.
I meant frustrated. I think frustrated was a better term because clearly the Gary Grimes character wanted more experience.
No, Max. I think you hit it on the nail in the beginning. Horny. They're just horny adolescents. That's all. And I thought it just added an amusement to what kids at that age really do go through. But in Hermie's case, it just happened in an entirely different emotional way and not a physical.
And it's also worth remembering that their really frank, gross talk was only with each other.
Yes.
When Hermie goes to the pharmacy, he's suddenly all tongue-tied and doesn't know what to say, what vocabulary to use. So
and the sneaking of the books. I mean, kids did that all the time with their fathers or big brothers' Playboy magazines. They would stand on stools to get them because the parents hid it. It was just a very natural thing of that age.
I wished I had checked the stopwatch on the film because it seemed as though the Jennifer O'Neill character disappears for a lengthy period of time in the narrative. Because we are focusing more on Hermie and his friends, and she's gone for quite a while, and that's why I thought the trailer seemed to appear that the narrative was really exclusively about the two of them, when actually she almost disappears from the narrative for a while. That was my reaction.
Well, she disappears physically, but I don't think she ever disappears from Hermie's mind. I think I just got the impression that he was always thinking about her. And when he's, in the movie with this, other woman and all, it was kind of forced that he really wished he was with her. That's just my impression.
No, and a good one. She has a presence.
She has cast a spell on him. Yeah.
Oh, thank you, Marjorie.
Thank you.
Thanks, Marjorie, as always.
Thank
Joshua, looks like
we'll ask him to start his. You can start your video now, Josh.
Okay. I don't remember the movie. I may have seen it, but I replayed it just before your session began. And I have to tell you, I was really grabbed by it. It was, I thought, a charming but very complex movie. And it reminded me a lot of those years when I was that age. I remember having to go to the pharmacy locally, and I was asked by my mother to pick up a box of Tampax, and how ashamed I was, how tough that was. The other thing that it reminded me of was in terms of the whole condom scene. Of course, when when young boys bought our first condoms, it was something to. It was stressful also. But I remember also I was an undergraduate at Columbia, and the Columbia crew team was famous. Whenever somebody came down to row in the river, in the Harlem River, the joke among the coxswains was you never wanted to win because the coxswain got thrown into the water, which was loaded with condoms. We used to call them Harlem River whitefish. Anyway, it was very enjoyable. I always learn and love it. Thanks much, guys.
Thank you, Joshua. We really appreciate the recollections. Thank you so much. A couple of comments that are worth mentioning here. Della Smith wrote that she was moved by the almost total silence from the love scene to the end of the movie, a relief especially after his friend's endless chatter. It showed that Hermie was thinking, pondering what had happened, that there was much more to sex than just copping a feel or scoring. He was changed. And then Marjorie added that she said she used to have to buy condoms for her cousin because he was embarrassed.
Yeah, those were the days, right?
Those were the days. While we're on the subject, I remember as a teen, I was on a Greyhound bus going to Chicago, and I was talking to a really cool retired professor, an elderly gentleman. And don't ask me how the subject came up of contraceptives, but he was talking about in his day, they were known as safes. So that might have been the 1920s or so, but I just thought I'd throw that out there. Anyway.
I don't see more hands raised, but Sheila, I noticed, unmuted herself. So Sheila, I don't know if you had a question. No, maybe not. Are there any other questions out there? Certainly go ahead and raise your hand.
I have one personal comment to make. And this derives from my name, which most of you know by now, and that Gary Grimes' next film was a John Wayne film called Cahill, U.S. Marshal. Now, I don't know if Gary or Max have ever had an experience like this. Max, I'm sure, knows that there is a film named Alvarez Kelly.
Yes.
And I doubt if there's ever been a Palmucci U.S. Marshal.
There's an Italian actor named Carlo Palmucci who turns up occasionally. I think he's in The Leopard, as a matter of fact. That's why.
Interesting. Okay. But what really nailed the coffin on this one is that the character played by Gary Grimes is John Wayne, Marshal Cahill's son, Danny. And as a result, I've never been able to watch more than 10 minutes or so of the movie. Many of you know I have an allergy to John Wayne, but this really did me in. Maybe one day on my deathbed, I'll lie there and watch it. I don't know, but.
Well, because Dan recently gave a wonderful lecture for New Plaza, World War II films without John Wayne.
There you go.
You know,
and all the better for it.
Well, they were expendable. That may be the only creditable World War II film of his at this moment in time, which he has a supporting role in.
Anything to add, Sean, before we wrap things up?
I don't have anything to add. Do you want to finish and talk a little bit about did you want to mention that your upcoming lecture? And
it's a brand new lecture, never done it anywhere else, because it's his birthday month. Stanley Kubrick, a director who we've talked about, and we will, at the end of July, be talking about Kubrick's film noir, The Killing. This is after the Alan K. Rode program, a couple of weeks later. So my next talk back for New Plaza, late in July, will be on Kubrick, and then we'll be talking about The Killing.
Well, Max, if you want to use on that show the unrated version of Eyes Wide Shut to show the orgy scene as it originally appeared, we should talk about that.
We need to talk, Gary, because I already have an idea. My plan is to do a comparative study between the uncut orgy scene and the censored orgy scene. So those of you want to get some thrills, you can sign up for that lecture and see the comparison.
Right. You thought Stanley was this cold, boring guy.
He's not at all.
No, your box office just exploded, Max. Everybody's going to be tuning in.
Well, you guys, I don't know. We've got to be careful because we are a family-oriented organization, and we've had a lot of talk of contraceptives and sex today, and I don't know.
Jennifer O'Neill put us in the mood. In intimate situations, we advocate responsible behavior at New Plaza Cinema.
For that, yeah.